You're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Terrorists go home! 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 Terrorists go away! Terrorists go away! Terrorists go away! Terrorists go away! Drinking water? Is that what you're doing? Dude, I guess you can get out. You have a home to go to. You have people. There are people who are dead here and are injured in some hospital and you are fucking here doing this, but you can just stand up and get terrorists go home! Get out of here! Terrorists go home! Terrorists down! Terrorists down! Terrorists down! Terrorists down! Racists go home! Racists go home! Racists go home! Racists go home! The racists go home!
But it's not patriotic now.
I wanted to honor my ancestors today, sir. They need to know that what they fought for wasn't slavery or oppression of people.
Where were they? And where are they?
Thank you, sir.
Flag is back there.
When
Put it in there.
innocent people are being terrorized by him and his cronies. So,
You're doing what you asked. Have a seat, sir.
can't walk out of the park by yourself, huh? So proud and brave.
You want another day like Saturday, don't you? You should be ashamed of yourself.
That blood is on your hands.
What you just saw or heard, depending on which venue you use to view or listen to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, was about a minute and a half's worth of footage. It was kind of a montage, just kind of a collection, some little shots of what happened on the day that Allen Armentrout went to Charlottesville. Of course, you remember the story made national news. A young man from Pensacola Christian College, a college student, dressed in a Confederate uniform, stood at the statue of Robert E. Lee, and he saluted the statue for several hours while protesters and just violent, wicked people got in his face and spit on him and pushed him and shoved him and just did all kinds of things to him, trying to rattle him, trying to provoke a response, hoping that maybe he would try to defend himself with the gun that he was carrying. You know, anything to create an incident there. And yet this young man, just a tremendous young man, he stood there and he saluted the statue and he maintained his composure and he honored his ancestors and he did not allow the crowd to rattle him. And finally, after several hours, the police finally came in and rescued him. And it made national news, and it was just a testimony to the Holy Spirit that indwells him, to the parents who raised him, just to the church that he grew up in. Just tremendous testimony. And it was my honor back, I want to say in August, to interview him. We recorded the interview back then. And I really wish we could have got it up sooner. It just, I kept doing other interviews and for whatever reason, getting the Allen Armentrout interview, I just kept pushing it and pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. And I really shouldn't have done that. And I want to apologize to all of you, our listeners, for having done so. But we're finally getting it up here for you. And that's obviously why I'm wearing a different shirt from the one I'm wearing in the interview, because we recorded the interview several months ago. And now it's like 3-4 months later, and we're finally piecing this together and putting it up there for you, our listeners. Oh, by the way, how do you like... where's it? Here it is. How do you like the new shirt? CTBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. Anyways, just thought I'd point that out to you. But it's a great interview with Allen Armentrout. We talk about a lot of stuff. In addition to Civil War reenacting, he's also a World War II reenactor. We talk about that a little bit. We talk about the political situation that's going on. We talk about how he was expelled from Pensacola Christian College and how that was really a blessing in his life, because I'll just say it, Pensacola Christian College is a joke. It's kind of hard to call it Christian or a college. It's really just that hokey of a place. And I'd kind of figured that out when I was a teenager. I actually visited there as a high school student, as a prospective college student. And I've got to say, it was the best game I ever bowled in my life. I was in their bowling alley, and I bowled a 280. I literally came within 2 strikes of a perfect game. And you say, well, how did you do that? Well, literally, I bowled 10 strikes in a row. And then you get the 2 bonus frames, and I realized I had a perfect game going, and I freaked out, and I rolled 2 gutter balls in a row. But, the week that I spent on their campus as a potential student was enough to tell me that this place is a joke, and I didn't want to go there. But anyways, had Allen graduated from there, he would have had a degree from an unaccredited school that people would have laughed at. Whereas now he's going to a university and he's getting a degree that people will respect, that potential employers will look at and will want to hire him because of it. And so really, getting kicked out of Pensacola Christian College, shame on them for having done that to this tremendous young man who was actually a testimony and a shining example of what a Christian should be. So shame on them for having done that to him. But good for him that the Lord, of course, the Bible says all things work together for good to them who are the called according to his purpose. And so God's used it in his life to enable him to go to a better school. And it's just been a great blessing in his life. Anyways, I don't want to go into preacher mode here and sermonify or anything like that. But I do want to get us into this great interview with Allen Armentrout.
What inspired you to go to Charlottesville that day?
Well, I felt spiritually led to go, sir. I saw what the protesters did in Durham on the TV. I saw them take a tie-down strap and actually rip it off the mount, the pedestal there, and the police just watched. And I honestly felt that if I could go up there in some way, I could defend it or prevent that from ever happening to the one in Charlottesville. Because I knew that one was also under a lot of controversy that weekend.
So you said you watched the one in Durham. Did you watch it on TV, or were you literally there watching it?
No, sir. It was in TV.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Because I know that you live in North Carolina, or you're from there. How close to Durham do you live?
Currently, I'm quite a ways away. Growing up, I wasn't too far. My grandparents lived in the Durham area, so I had seen that monument before and been through that area.
Uh-huh.
So I was probably growing up, probably about 2.5 hours. I used to go there all the time to see my grandparents, though.
You don't have to give us the particulars, obviously. Just kind of put it in a general area for us. What part of the state of North Carolina do you live in?
The Triad area. The
Okay.
Greensboro area.
Well, what area was that?
The Triad, Greensboro area.
Okay. I recently took a vacation. I say recently. It was probably 6 weeks ago now. And we went to Otto, North Carolina.
Okay.
And a little bit of ways from there, over there, Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina kind of come together over there.
Okay.
And let's just say that I was a 3/4 of a mile walk from the cabin where they played the banjo in Deliverance.
Yeah.
And, I tell people that, and they think I'm just trying to make a joke about what the area was like, but it literally was the cabin where the kid played the banjo in Deliverance.
That's great.
And the funny thing is that next to it, there's a really nice house now. And I guess the money that they made from Deliverance is what they built the house with.
All right.
But yeah, there are some nice houses in that area, because I guess they used a lot of the locals in that movie.
Right.
And so, I mean, they didn't get rich, but they did make enough money to, at least a few of them had the sense, if you will, to take the money that they had and put it into something like a house. But yeah, it was beautiful. The cabin that we were in was on a road that, had I not taken my truck up there, we would not have got up there. We would not have got up there in my wife's car. And but it was a great trip, and we enjoyed it a lot. I know of all the places in the country that I've ever lived or been, and my wife went to college in North Carolina as well. And so, of all the places we've lived or been, and we had this discussion maybe about 1.5 years ago, where would we go back to? And
the one place that we both agreed on was North Carolina. So
It's a great state. I love it.
have you done reenacting?
Yes, sir.
Okay, because I know when you were in Charlottesville, you were in a uniform.
Right.
And so I guess that's just the typical uniform you would have wore if you were doing reenacting.
Yes, sir.
So how did you get into reenacting?
I started reenacting when I was about 14. I'm 22 now, so I've been doing that for, 8 years now.
Okay.
I primarily do World War II, actually. That's kind of my main hobby. Civil War came along later in life. I was actually at an air show and saw some guys doing some reenacting and got super interested. Started purchasing some gear and some things like that. Started mowing a lot of yards and started purchasing my stuff and took a lot of loaner gear. And then eventually, as I started getting a job and things like that, I started piecing together some impressions and started having a lot of fun.
So tell me what your World War II impression is.
So I do a paratrooper impression, but we also do some regular leg infantry impressions and things like that. Just based on what the setting is or what era throughout the war we do, it depends on that. So.
Well, I don't see you doing a Japanese impression. So are you an Allied soldier or are you a Nazi soldier?
Yes, sir. American side.
Okay. A lot of guys who do Civil War reenacting that also do World War II reenacting.
Right.
And, a lot of the guys who do Civil War reenacting will do both impressions depending on where the need is in that particular event. And I know some of these World War II guys are the same way. And especially those who are really in it, will have enough gear and enough clothing to be able to move around like that. And I thought that I got in trouble. I was in South Carolina, about 12 years ago. And I was driving a Suburban at the time, and I get pulled over by a black state trooper. I don't know if it was because my Suburban windows in the back were tinted. I don't know if it was because he just wanted to fish around. I don't know what it was. But he pulls me over right outside of Greenville on I-85. He was riding my bumper for the longest time. and then he finally hits his lights after like 5 or 6 miles. And I pull over and he walks up to the window and he says, "Sir, do you have any idea why I pulled you over?" And I said, "No, sir, I don't." I said, "But if I were a state trooper, I would have pulled you over for riding my bumper for the last 5 miles. I said, "I don't know about South Carolina, but in Texas, we have laws about following too closely." And he just looked at me, and then he said, "Well, sir," he said, "the reason I pulled you over is because you're driving too perfectly." He said, "Anybody who drives as perfectly as you do is trying not to get pulled over."
Yeah.
I'm like, "Well, okay."
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Well," I said, if I'm driving too perfectly, I said, I guess that's a testimony to my grandfather, because he's the one who taught me to drive." And so he wants to inspect the vehicle. So anyways, he's flashing his light through the windows and everything, and he sees rifles. So now he's got probable cause to open up the vehicle because he sees these rifles. So okay. So he's digging through everything, and he sees some Confederate flags. He sees some rifles. I'm actually dressed as a captain, as a Confederate captain. And so he's asking me, well, first he asked me, he says, "Is there a reason why you have all?" He didn't ask about the guns. "Is there a reason why you have all these Confederate flags back here?" And I just looked at him. I said, "Trooper," I'm standing outside of the Suburban. I said, "Trooper," I said, "You mean to tell me this is the first time you've seen a Confederate flag in South Carolina?" And he's like, "No, sir, I've seen a lot of them." He said, I just wonder why somebody from Texas is, standing next to I-85 in a Confederate uniform with a bunch of Confederate flags and a Suburban full of guns." And I told him the Civil War reenactment I was at, and he literally went through every gun to make sure it was a black powder gun and whatever, and, he finally let me go. But I told all that to say this. I had another friend of mine who a couple of years later got pulled over with a van full of guns and Nazi uniforms. And you think I had a hard time in South Carolina with a Confederate flag. You want to see the hassle that he had, but
we had something like that. We were driving a Dodge pickup truck with an army trailer, and we got pulled over, and it was about 6 of us crammed in that pickup truck. And he said, "Do you have any weapons in the vehicle?" Yeah, we said we got about 2 Thompson machine guns and a bazooka and a mortar in the back if you want to see that, and. And he was just like, no, that's fine, But yeah, we've had a moment like that too.
Yeah. I know one time I crossed the Mexican border. I was at a reenactment in Texas, and I was headed to another one, and it was over in New Mexico. And I had to drive through El Paso to make that trip. And I don't know what in the world possessed me to do this. But when I got to El Paso, I decided to jump across the border into Juarez. And so I wound up actually eating at the Denny's in Juarez.
Okay.
And it's, eating Mexican Denny's in Juarez is great because it's just like American Denny's. You don't have to actually know any words to read the menu. You just point at stuff. Again, I don't know what possessed me to do it. I just, one of those things. And so I go across the border and end up about the only thing that's open is the Denny's. So I eat at the Denny's, and I'm coming back across the border. And I forgot I only had 1 black powder rifle and 1 black powder pistol in my trunk. And of course, I'm driving through the little booth, and they have the little scanner that I guess scans the vehicles or whatever. And they actually scan you a few feet back past the booth. So anyways, something flags the guy. And so he actually wants to inspect the vehicle. He opens up the trunk, and it's like, oh, crap, I remember that was in there. And so I'm looking at it, and he's like looking at it. And so I just told him, I was a Civil War reenactor or whatever. So anyways, he looks at it, and it's a black powder rifle. It's a black powder pistol. There's a box of, powder or whatever. Bunch of paper wads. And he decides that since there was no ammunition, because just had the black powder but didn't have any shells, and since it's the best he could tell by looking at it, it was an antique. It wasn't, but he was
right.
So anyway, so he let it go that I was transporting an antique firearm or whatever, and he let it go, and but I guess he could have confiscated them probably if he wanted to.
Right.
And
right.
had it been something firearm wise that he would have personally wanted, he probably would have. But you started your impressions with World War II. I'm going to guess that was your area of interest before the war between the states was?
Yes, sir.
So what made you interested in the war between the states?
Just personal genealogy research and things, finding out about it. I'd always been a little interested in it. I still would say war between the state reenacting is still not my main focus.
Okay.
It's still World War II. It's just because you get so invested and you spend so much money on one hobby, it's really, really hard to switch.
Right.
So I'm just getting, I've got a basic kit together for Civil War, but I wouldn't say that I'm like a diehard, for Civil War reenacting. I'm still more of a World War II reenactor. So, but I do enjoy doing Civil War reenacting. I guess, interested in it because I just wanted to be able to honor my ancestor and be able to, do an impression of him and be able to go and do some battles here and there.
Right.
So
I'm going to tell you one story, and then I'll ask you a question, and then we'll move on from the World War II subject.
Okay.
But you went to Pensacola Christian College, so I know you know who Dr. Peter Ruckman is.
Right.
Some of our listeners may not know who he is, but I know you'll know who he is. And This was, probably 20 years ago now. I ate lunch at Dr. Ruckman's home.
Okay.
Not lunch, I'm sorry, dinner. I had dinner at Dr. Ruckman's home. Believe it or not, I'd had lunch that day at Pensacola Christian College.
Okay.
Which, had they known where I was going for dinner that night, they would not have, A, not have fed me lunch, and B, never invited me back. But my wife had told me, she said that she wanted to meet Dr. Ruckman while we were in Pensacola. And so we went to Dr. Ruckman's bookstore, and they told me that he wasn't in the office that day, but that he was at home. And so they called over there, and he's like, oh, yeah, just tell him to come to the house, and ended up eating dinner. But Dr. Ruckman took me into his personal studio where he does his painting. And there was a portrait hanging on the wall in there. And it was a huge portrait. One of the biggest pieces of canvas he had painted on. And it was a painting of himself in a Nazi uniform, with all the iron crosses and everything on it. And I knew he was of the age to have fought in World War II. And I asked him, I said, Dr. Ruckman, I said, did you fight for the Nazis in World War II? And it was a young version of himself that he'd painted. And he said, no. He said, I was in the U.S. Army during World War II. He said, I served in the Philippines in the U.S. Army, and he did some radio whatever work in Asia or whatever as part of in his U.S. Army assignment. I said, then why did you paint yourself in a Nazi uniform? He said, because I'm tired of all of these liberals trying to say that Ruckman is a Nazi. He said, I'm tired of the people over at the college, he was referring to PCC, saying that Ruckman is a Nazi. He said, I'm not a Nazi. He said, but the next time somebody wants to call me a Nazi, he said, for $20,000, I'll sell them some proof.
Yeah.
So he had painted a picture of himself in a Nazi uniform. So I'm going to ask the question, is there a picture of Allen Armentrout somewhere in a Nazi uniform?
No, sir.
Okay.
No.
Because I was going to, if there were one, I mean, it would be innocent. You would have been doing reenacting. But do you realize that if that were to ever get out, you'd be the next Dylan Roof?
Right, yeah. I've never done German reenacting. I've got a lot of German reenactor friends.
Uh-huh.
But German reenacting is just so expensive. I mean, it's really pricey. But I have considered doing German reenacting one of these days.
But there are pictures of you in a U.S. paratrooper uniform.
Oh, yes, sir. Mm-hmm.
Could you email one of those?
It's not like many people know the difference between an American and German uniform in World War II anyway these days.
Okay.
So I'm just saying, people still think we're still active military. Like, they see our uniforms, they don't know.
Right.
People are historically ignorant as it is,
I was going to say, one of these, if you want to text me a picture, you don't have to do it right now, but after we're done or something, text me a picture of you in your World War II uniform.
Okay.
And, but you had said that your impression that you do in Civil War reenacting is of your ancestors. So tell me a little bit about, do you just have the one Confederate ancestor? Or?
The one that I directly claim, but I know that I have a lot of uncles that also served, and cousins as well. I've not Googled the Fold 3. I've put our last name in there, and there's a lot of results. And I know that somewhere back throughout the line that we're all related. And I mean, I know a lot of people say, oh, Adam and Eve, we're all related. But seriously, though, like, all of the ancestors of the Armentrouts come back to 3 brothers that came here back in the 1740s. And so seriously, like, if you trace it back enough, like 5 to 6 generations, you'll find where the connection is. So everybody, all the Armentrouts in this country are related.
We are far enough into the show here that I am going to go ahead and interrupt just momentarily. We're going to insert our commercial for our sponsor, the Barnes Review, which is the TBR and TBR Radio presents, and then we'll be back with our interview. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org,
That's www.barnesreview.org. You can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
So you said 1740s. So then you have Revolutionary War veterans as well in your ancestry?
French and Indian all the way up to now. So yes, sir.
So have you joined the Sons of the American Revolution?
I've wanted to. I've heard that they're just not very active. So I think they only have like one meeting a year or something like that. And I just haven't had an opportunity to be a part of one of those organizations yet.
See, I thought they were going to tell you to come back when you were 75.
Yeah, yeah, probably. Family moved over here in the 1740s. It was a widow and her 3 sons and a daughter. We're not really sure if she moved here because she was a widow or if the husband passed away on the trip over. Either way, we don't know really where he's buried or what his story is. They moved in the Pennsylvania area. I have to look exactly where they settled. They stayed there for about 5 to 10 years, and then they started to buy some of the land grants that were in Virginia. So my family was some of the first settlers into the Shenandoah Valley. They settled what's now known as Massanutten Mountain. They would have called it Peaked Mountain, in a town called Kieseltown, Virginia. And they would have raised a lot of generations there. They would have started a church down in McGaheysville, and then they eventually would have built a church. The first son that actually came from Germany, my direct line, was the Johann Philipp Armentrout line. And he fought in the French and Indian War. And then his son, Armentrout, they would have changed the name during the American Revolution, fought in the Revolutionary War. And then his son, Augustine Armentrout Sr., would have fought in the War of 1812. And then his son, Augustine Armentrout Sr., would have fought in the Stonewall Brigade in the Southern Army. Oh, okay.
So did he serve the whole course of the war and live through it, or was he wounded or killed? Or
So he was, okay, I was talking about my other ancestors. As far as him, he was in the 33rd Virginia, Company I. He fought from 1st Manassas all the way to Gettysburg. He had some periods of AWOL during to go back and get his harvest, and then he would come back and pay his bounty. Lots of soldiers did that. He was wounded several times. I went to a local library or a historical museum and went out and found out. It was really cool because we do historical research today, and we see everything's on the computer. But I went to this place, and this place operated like it was the 1970s or 60s. And I went up into the attic, and they just had these file cabinets all along the side, and you'd open them up, and it was organized by last name, and I was like, wow. And it was just a compilation of people who had come up there to do historical research and would make copies of everything they had found and would put it in this folder. And so I went to Armentrout, and I found 2 huge, thick, just full Armentrout, historical information. And I started flipping through it, and I just started finding stuff that, probably 90% of it wasn't on the internet. And it was just really, really cool stuff. I didn't know half of the Armentrouts in there, but some of the farther back, some questions were answered, and more were made. I found this little booklet. It was a folklore type, a third-hand account booklet of Augustine and his fighting in the war, and it said that he was wounded in the face, the chest, and then ultimately at Gettysburg in the arm, and then that he went to Ohio. Apparently the provost marshal up there released him to cousins that lived up in southeastern Ohio around Wheeling, West Virginia, on the line, on the state line there. And then he actually would have remarried. His first wife passed away in 1863, a couple months prior to Gettysburg, and then he would have remarried. That was my direct fourth great grandmother, and then he would have remarried and would have had a lot more kids with her. And he had a huge family when he came back down to Virginia. So sorry for that. I know that was a little.
Oh no, that's a good story. And I know a lot of our listeners have Confederate ancestry, and they like to talk about theirs, and they like to hear other people's stories as well. Did you join the Sons of Confederate Veterans at some point with this information, or?
So I had it, and I wanted to join. Honestly, I didn't really get super. I was young. I was like 15, 16 when I found this information out, and I had other things going on, but I didn't really get super motivated to join the SCV until when the Charleston church shooting happened. And that was my freshman year of college, and I got inducted in the Sons of Confederate Veterans.
So when you were a student, did you get inducted up in North Carolina, or did you do that down in Florida? Or
Florida.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
So did you get any feedback or blowback from the school for joining the Sons of Confederate Veterans down there, or was it an okay thing at that time? I'm
trying to decide whether or not I can discuss like a lot of this stuff.
Right. Well, you don't have to go into particular details, but was there any negative consequence or conversation that took place when you joined the SCV at that time, or was that a non-event?
I don't even really think they knew about it at first.
Okay.
So yeah, it's not like I made it known,
Okay.
But over time, things happened, and I can't really discuss a whole lot with the school. Just that we had disputes, but we came to an agreement. So
right. So when you joined the SCV at that time, I think 2015 that would have been. Did you go to meetings and stuff on a regular basis, or?
Oh yes, sir. So I got super motivated with the SCV. I went to every meeting they had, and I started going to all the city council, because at that time it was a national movement to get rid of Civil War monuments and any kind of names on schools or flags that were still flying. Mm-hmm. And Pensacola is the city of five flags. One of those five flags was the Confederate flag, and that was always been a controversial symbol. Ever since probably the 70s. They used to have Confederate soldiers, a Confederate stage actually in the float in the parade there a long time ago. Their Coliseum, they used to fly the Confederate battle flag, and then it turned into the First National, and now it's the state of Florida flag, which is not accurate, but what can you do? I joined up, and I started getting super active. Was probably the youngest in the group. Which here was the problem for me, was I ran into a lot of older gentlemen who had been doing it for decades and didn't like change and had pretty much been burnt out. They had done their duty and they were tired of it,
Right.
And so when I came in and was like, what's wrong with you guys? You guys need to get in gear and get this stuff. We need to fight, They had done their fight. But here was the problem, is even though they had done their fight, which I'm appreciative of, it's like they wouldn't turn the reins over to someone else to continue the fight. They didn't want to give up their title or their position.
Right.
And they ended up running me off. I raised several $1,000s. I ended up raising $7,000, a flagpole project that they had they had started the idea, kind of kicked the can around a little bit and wanted to know what everybody thought. So I went out and started raising money. I started selling flags on the street corner, which at that time were hotcakes, because you couldn't buy a flag on the internet. That was when eBay and all the rest of them started taking them off their sites. And so I was selling a Confederate flag which I would get for $1 or $2 at a wholesale website, and was turning around making $20 a pop off of them. Mm-hmm. And people were buying them up like, give me 10 flags, here's $200. It was crazy. I have some really great stories on all that stuff. That was some really fun times. And but I'd turn that money over, the profits over to the camp, and say, here's $1,000 in sales today. I need some more flags. and also a lot of donations. I was reaching out through Facebook. I started a Facebook page for them and started just reaching out and trying to make money. And in the end, okay, this is how it worked out. So I raised that much money and took the initiative to complete that project. I mean, I did the work. I figured out where to get the pole from, how to get it delivered, how to get it installed, where to get the flags from, how long they would last, a solar light. I even looked up insurance in case if there was a lightning strike or somebody vandalized the pole. I mean, I did all the legwork, raised all the money. And do you know that them crazy suckers down there wouldn't let me go to when they first raised the flag, and one of the members actually tried to throw a punch at the dedication ceremony, and yeah, I just and I didn't even get an award for it or nothing, and but hey, I was just like, what is wrong? But it was pride. That's all it was pride, and just childish stuff. People, they get to that position. I'm a commander of a camp, and what you say doesn't matter. And I ran into a lot of that. And but hey, I did what I did for my ancestor and to honor him and the men who served with him, and the flag's flying, and that's all that matters. I just ran into a lot of opposition because I kept hearing this phrase, and it really was starting to tick me off. You have to represent yourself as an individual, not as a camp member. I'm going to a city council meeting to defend like a city council or like a city seal or a county seal with a Confederate flag in it, or or a monument like in Crestview. I was really active in that. And they were telling me, oh, you have to represent yourself as an individual. And I'm like, well, why did I join this camp? Mm-hmm. I was reaching out to other SEV camps in the area, like, hey, well, actually, another division that was nearby, because on Pensacola, you're on the border. And I asked them to come down and help. And there was some controversy there. And I basically talked to the division commander and was like, hey, we're trying to save a Confederate monument / whatever else we were working on from getting thrown in the garbage, and I'm being told I can't rally people together. I mean, look, I've just run into a lot of politics and a lot of, I've been hit by both sides. I've been hit by people in Charlottesville and all that, but I've also been hit from my own people too. Right. But I will say that I've ran into a lot of really good patriots and people that would stand by my side no matter what. And I know that I have a lot of people that I can count on. And there's a lot of work that's been done, and I'm very thankful I had an opportunity to do some work with the SCV. And I do want to say one thing is that I know there's a lot of SCV haters out there. I admire the SCV. I think they're a very good organization. They've done a lot, and they will continue to do a lot. I know that under the new administration, I know they just elected a new CIC, and I know that his historical defense team is really ambitious, and I just know that they're really going to do a really good job handling this. Because I know that the SCV the prior administration, he didn't wake up one day and was told, hey, in 3 months there's going to be this entire anti-South sentiment that's going to just take over nationally like that, like in a heartbeat, and so, I think for not being honestly really prepared for the attack that we endured, I think the SCV did a good job. I mean, but at the same time, it's like, for instance, one thing with the SCV that kind of made me mad was the stand down they had in Louisiana.
Alan is about to tell us how he was actually there in New Orleans when they removed the monuments. He was part of the effort to rally there in support of the monuments, and he was there when they took them down. And we're going to let him tell us that story, but first we're going to have a word from our sponsor, the American Free Press.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States. The things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
When they removed the monuments, they had the crane there, and then the firefighters and their riot gear, and there was barely any pro-Confederate presence. And people kept telling me, "Oh well, we've already lost, and it doesn't matter if we're there or not. You know, they're taking it down." I'm like, it does matter. You know, it's like if you're willing to fight them in court, you should be willing to fight them in the field. You know, it's like I respect that. You know, fighting them in a courtroom on a lawsuit, but at the same time, it's like, pick up a flag and go and represent yourself and your ancestor. You know, I get sick and tired of that. When I was out there standing by myself at the Jefferson Davis Memorial for a long time, and others gathered, because Jefferson Davis in New Orleans was kind of the central point of where all the, you know, controversy had happened, but Beauregard Monument and then the Lee Monument. There's like nobody there. I'm like, these things are coming down and no one's here. And it made me really upset because it made me feel like no one cares. But it's sad because it kind of shows you that people don't care. You know, they'll tell you, "Oh, I'm a Southerner and I bleed red, white, and red." And I tell you, you know, and my ancestors fought and blah blah blah, and you know. But then it's like, when something happens and action is needed and the call is out there for help, it's like it's a Facebook post or it's a comment on Facebook on a live video of someone who actually is doing something and they feel like they've done their part. It's like, well, sacrifice your time, sacrifice a little gas, sacrifice a little bit of your time and get in your car and go. You know, and that's what I did. I said, I'm not going to sit around and just complain. I said, I don't have a right to complain unless I'm a part of it and I'm actually doing something. You know, I don't think you have a right to complain. It's the same thing like people voting. People complain about a vote or someone getting elected. Like, well, did you vote? Like, no. Well, then you don't have a right to complain if you didn't partake in, the election. And then trying to relate this back to the whole monuments thing. You can't complain about the monuments being taken down if you're just sitting on watching it on your phone in your living room. Okay, you need to get out there and fight for them. I know I went on a little bit of a rant, but
go ahead.
Yeah, I get sick and tired of people saying they care about it and then they don't do anything about it. It's like, it's a really sad. I don't know what it's going to take for people to get motivated. Does it take them? Does it? I mean, at what point I'm not discounting everybody, because I know there's a lot of Southerners out there who have taken the stand, but it's so few, and that's my concern. Is it's not that there's not anybody, but it's just that there's so few, because I want to shout out to the Virginia Flaggers, they are super active, super motivated. They are a no politicking, get her done type organization that raises flags, raises money, and protests organizations that start to take down our symbols and our heritage and destroy our history and whatnot. And I have a lot of respect for them because they can rally the troops, and those people genuinely care about their history and heritage. But other areas of the country seem to lack in some, because I've traveled everywhere. I've been to Florida, Alabama. Alabama's a good state. They've done a lot for their heritage. I guess people do what they can, but at the same time, it just made me feel very lonely when I was in New Orleans, just about by myself. Where are the good guys? Where are they? When is the cavalry gonna literally come down and swoop in? And I was waiting for that moment, but it never came. But
So when you were in New Orleans, were you there in uniform with the rifle as well, or?
Yes, sir. So I was the same setup as I was in Charlottesville, but the New Orleans Police Department was not very. They were not really engaged in protection of us, and also came up with some baloney reasons to tell us that we had to disarm ourselves. They told us that we were near a school zone and had to take our guns away, put them back in our vehicles. And the school was literally 5 miles down the road. Mm-hmm. And we were well, they were well, if you don't put your weapons away, we're going to arrest you for having a gun in the school zone. But that was just part of Leandrew's, disarming up, because, we were bodily threatened. I mean, we were battered, down there.
In Louisiana?
Right.
Okay. People are going to think that I'm race baiting, but I'm not. But it will lead to another question. Potentially, depending on your answer to this one. The police officers who harassed you in New Orleans, were they white? Were they black? Were they Hispanic? Were they Asian?
It was a mixture of everything, honestly. But one thing I did want to say is that we had a lot of black support down there. Mm-hmm. If we want to talk about race and stuff, we had numerous, because I would say that probably the predominant population base in New Orleans is African American. I mean, that's a fact. It's not racial or anything. It's just what it is. But we actually had a lot of black folks coming up to us telling us what they're doing is stupid. They shouldn't be doing that. They don't speak for us,
Right.
And we're well, we agree. I mean, I had a guy in a cowboy hat, black guy in a cowboy hat. He's like, my great grandfather owned a plantation and owned slaves. He was black. He's has nothing to do with race,
Well, I would need to double check this to verify it. I'm just, I'm saying something off the top of my head from memory. But if my memory is correct, the largest plantation and the largest slave owner
in the state of Louisiana was owned by a black man
Right.
who himself had been a slave before he was freed.
I tell people, I was like, slavery is not a racial matter. Slavery is an economical matter. It's people could not afford to take care of themselves, or they were forced into slavery. But at the same point, it's like it's an economical class. It's like you have, slave, poor, middle class, and rich. And it's just it was a social class at the time. Now we don't have that social class anymore, but at that time, I still believe in indentured servitude. I think I don't believe in all this government, assistance and all that stuff, because that's not my tax dollars go to help pay for some bum who refuses to work. I don't believe in all that redistribution of wealth. I don't believe in all that stuff. I believe you work. I believe you either if you don't work, you don't eat, kind of thing. And so, are you familiar with indentured servitude?
I am.
So it's like, if somebody goes through high school and has no job and has no means of feeding himself, like, he should have the maturity and responsibility to sign himself over to someone who can teach him a skill or trade that he can live on that man's property and eat off of his food, and then work for him for a reduced price so that he can learn how to do something. But that's a time long forgotten. So people would just rather sit in their room and play video games and take a government check. So,
well, you talk about slavery as an economic matter and as a class. If you study history, every empire, every civilization throughout history has always needed a source of cheap labor.
Right.
And for millennia, that source of cheap labor was slavery.
Right.
And in this country, just to put it in a context that everybody can understand and relate to, the abolition of slavery across the globe was really a 19th century phenomenon.
Right.
Up until that time, up until the 18th and 19th centuries, slavery was pretty well established around the world. And for that matter, it still is. I read an article the other day that come to find out in the United Kingdom, the British are having a real time right now because of all the slave labor on the farms. The British abolished slavery before the Americans did, but yet they have, supposedly hundreds of thousands of slave laborers on farms in the United Kingdom. So how did that happen? Anyways, different conversation. But you always have to have a source of cheap labor. So in this country, they did away with slavery. But so who was going to do the backbreaking labor to run the railroads out west? Oh, well, don't worry about it. We'll just bring in all these Chinese immigrants.
Yeah.
We'll let the Chinese immigrants do it. They'll work for peanuts. Well, the railroad was built, and we didn't need the Chinese labor anymore, so what happened? They banned immigration from Asian countries, and for a number of years, Asians couldn't even immigrate to this country. But then the Industrial Revolution kicks off. And so people who would have been working in agriculture are now working in factories. And it's like, hey, we need cheap labor again in the agricultural sector. Well, don't worry. Mexicans will come up and do that, and they'll be our source of cheap labor. And that worked for a while. And then in the 20th century, they passed laws to make that immigration illegal. And so what's happened? We still have a source of cheap labor. It's just instead of legal immigrants, they're now illegal immigrants.
All right.
But the truth is if we still had slavery today, we wouldn't have an illegal immigration problem because A, we would not need a source of cheap labor, and B, there wouldn't be jobs for these people to come into, and so they wouldn't have an incentive to come here illegally to get them. But yeah, so slavery, it was an economic necessity to some degree because if for no other reason, because a society needs a source of cheap labor, and it's going to get it from somewhere.
Yeah, it's just people make it out to be a racial thing, like that the white man was subjugating, the black man, and that's not what it was about. It was, like you said, an economical thing. They needed a source of cheap labor for their way of life. And it wasn't just a Southern thing either. It's a national thing. It's been a national thing since the beginning, and it's still a national thing today. The North had cheap labor too. Look at the Irish slaves that they were bringing over, you know, for the factories and things.
Can't think of a more controversial place to end this interview than right here. So, since we've only got about 5 minutes of broadcast time left, I'm just going to cut it off right here and have a little closing monologue, and then we'll leave you until next week. But I do want to thank you for taking the time to listen to this week's episode of TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. And I hope that our interview with Allen Armentrout was thought-provoking. I hope that you enjoyed getting to know Allen just a little bit better. Actually, I recorded about an hour and a half's worth of interview with Allen, and we've only played about half of it, about 45 minutes of it, here in today's broadcast. So what we're going to do is next week we're going to finish it, and we're going to have the second half of the interview with Allen next week, and we're going to talk about more of what Allen did in New Orleans, more about exactly what was happening in Charlottesville and what it was like for him to endure the things that he endured on that day. We're also going to talk about the things that he's doing now. Allen is doing some tremendous things now, and some tremendous opportunities that have been made available to him because of the stand that he took and the people that he met in the process of that. And also getting to change schools. We're going to talk a little bit about him getting kicked out of Pensacola Christian College and him transferring to a different university, and also some of the opportunities that have been afforded to him in his new program at the new school. And so it's going to be a conversation that you're not going to want to miss. In fact, next week I've even got some footage. He made the news in Russia, and we've even got the news footage of that. So you don't want to miss next week's TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. Until then, what I'd like to ask you to do is I would like you to get on Facebook. Go to facebook.com/Allen.Armentrout. Facebook.com/Allen.Armentrout. And you'll see Allen's Facebook page there. Some great pictures of him in his World War II reenacting uniform. Some great pictures of him serving in an honor guard and a military funeral. It's just some great stuff there, and you'll enjoy looking at that, and maybe it'll give you an opportunity to reach out to Allen and get to know him just a little bit. I also want to bring this to our readers' attention, or to our listeners' attention rather, and that is that when the one advantage that he would have had of staying at Pensacola Christian College is that they have a program whereby fourth-year students essentially get to attend the school tuition free. I think one of the reasons that they do that is because so many of their students realize what a joke the place is, and they just bail out. And they don't stay for their senior year. In fact, very few of them stay past their freshman year. But he could have, had he stayed and gone into his senior year, finished his senior year there, it would have been tuition free. Now he's going to a much larger university where not only is the tuition considerably higher than it would have been at PCC, he's also having to pay it because the scholarship that would have enabled him to have his fourth year free is not available at this new university. He is working and paying his way through school. He's also struggling. And so if you want to be a blessing to him, if you want to say thank you to him for standing for our heritage, when you go to his Facebook page, facebook.com/Allen.Armentrout, send him a message and just say, hey, you know what? I heard your interview on the Dixie Heritage Hour with Dr. Ed, and we would really like to help you with your college tuition. Can we give you a gift? And he'll tell you how to go about doing that. I know that he's accepting gifts through PayPal and so forth. And so that would be a real help and a blessing to him. Also, while you're at it, go to my website, www.dixieheritage.net, www.dixieheritage.net. And if you're not already a subscriber to the weekly Dixie Heritage newsletter, just give us your email address, and When you do, we'll sign you up for the newsletter free of charge. You'll receive it every week, no cost, no obligation. And I'll also email you a free copy of my ebook, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. Once again, no cost, no obligation. We're not going to hit you up for a credit card number or anything like that. We just want to put the information in your hands. And check out our sponsor's website, barnesreview.org. And also, maybe even shoot us an email and let us know who you are and how you're listening to TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour. We always love to hear from our listeners. So until next week, from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, God bless.